consumers being fleeced at the checkout?
Well, I certainly think there is good cause for us to look at the way our supermarkets are working in New Zealand. We do have a heavy concentration amongst a couple of big players, and that in our mind is good cause for us to look at whether or not New Zealand is being treated fairly.
The Advertising Standards Authority has found that the National Party's wealth tax ad in the last week or so of the campaign was misleading. Do you agree?
Oh, well, look, certainly we had concerns, and I raised them during the campaign around the way some policies were being treated by other parties. But look, I raised them at the time. Obviously, a separate process enables us to have someone who doesn't have that political interest make that call too.
Would you like to see prices?
Why won't you go near an asset tax?
Well, we already, during the election, put forward our plans around taxation. You know, everyone knows that for a number of elections, Labor did campaign on a capital gains tax. That was something that we weren't able to win over New Zealanders with those campaigns, and we've accepted that.
So Michael Cullen has raised concerns about the Reserve Bank. Do you share his concerns?
Well, look, I haven't seen those comments by Sir Michael, so I'd be wary about making any statements without having seen his comments or the context of them.
He raised concerns about the injection that the Reserve Bank has put into the housing market and meaning that it's a lot easier for people to buy houses, those who can afford it.
Oh, look, at the same time, Sir Michael would also appreciate that he's able to make such comments. I need to leave the decisions of the Reserve Bank to the Reserve Bank. But it is fair to say the situation New Zealand finds itself in is not different to what most of the world is experiencing right now.
National is called
do you think there's going to be, though, resentment about that gap, especially with housing accelerating in terms of unaffordability?
It goes both ways. Of course, a first home buyer will be considering both the price of housing but also their ability to service mortgages. And of course, low interest rates help with the latter. We as a government are focused on what can we do around the fact that we have escalating house prices and at the same time that barrier of deposits for first home buyers.
So when you get to $1 million average in Auckland, then actually servicing a mortgage probably
Yeah,
actually isn't even a thing, because you can't
And yet-
raise that money to even get there.
Yeah,
So.
and that's why, as I've said, we've honed in on deposits. There are those in Auckland who say that actually the rent that they're paying would mean that it was possible for them to be in home ownership, but that deposit is a hurdle, which is why we are continuing to look at products that may assist with that, like progressive home ownership.
So will you do anything on the demand side, or are you purely looking at supply?
Well, look, we have to keep in mind on the demand side, we have a significant reduction, obviously, in the population growth we usually experience in New Zealand by as a consequence of our border closures. And so, look, some of the official data around that, still firming up, but it's fair to say that a bit of pressure has naturally come off there.
There's no sign demand is going to ease, though. I mean, all of the predictions are it's actually going to get worse.
And yet the predictions just several months ago were a collapse of the housing market. Yes, we are concerned about what's happening with house prices, but it's not fair to say that there is simply one contributing factor, which is why we're looking at a range of options to help.
National have called for you specifically to, quote, rein in the Reserve Bank. Is that something that you're going to consider doing?
That seems a significant departure for a political party in New Zealand to move away from what has been long-term consensus around a separation between politicians and the rest
So
of
it's
the
a bit reckless for them to make that
I'd
call?
say that is concerning. There's very good reason we have those separations. Hard lessons as a country several decades ago, and we haven't forgotten those.
You do have some levers like the Monetary Policy Committee, and you at the start of last term you asked the Reserve Bank to look at it. So clearly there is an appetite for it.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about that
Not
yesterday.
directly intervening. What's so different about employment in the housing market?
Oh, and look, we did talk a little bit about that yesterday. There are mechanisms. We go through a proper process before we use any of those levers. Those are rightly things that, of course, the Minister of Finance engages around. And yes, we have been willing to use them. But those are matters I leave for our wider government consideration.
What is the reasonable? Do you look at the government products like the Home Start grant and look at moving those thresholds?
As I've said, those are, I think, a natural place for us to look at and say, look, are there ways that we can enable more first home buyers to use those products? And that's one of the areas that I have asked for advice around.
So when you say what is a reasonable number of houses for one person to own?
Look, I'm of the view that where our focus should be as a government is enabling first home buyers to get into houses, to have one home home to call their own. That's where our focus is. Keep in mind, we have been concerned around whether or not some of the activity from those who are acting as speculators are operating. That's why we extended the bright line test. It's why we closed tax loopholes.
So would you look at things, you mentioned deposits and things like the Home Start grant, would you look at KiwiSaver? Are you actively looking at basically allowing people to raise deposits? Is that the...
In that space, I'm looking at all options that do overcome that hurdle that at the moment means the difference between some people becoming homeowners is whether or not their parents can support them into a home. That's not the kind of divide we want in New Zealand. It's not who we are. We want it to be an accessible market. That's one of the things we can do.
Coming back to the demand side.
I'll give Bernard a go.
Do you think it's fair, though, that the banks could lend that $28 billion to rental property investors alone, rather than people in business or people building new homes? That's what National is saying, that's what you need to intervene and stop.
Well, actually, the Reserve Bank obviously are consulting at the moment in the way that they would, for instance, utilise the LVR in order to actually target and lift the expectations on the way banks are operating with investors specifically. So obviously they are of the mind to think differently about who it is that we are lending to.
Do you want to see prices come down?
That's different to what National's saying. That's for the funding for lending program, which is the $28 billion. Do you think that that should be directed to productive?
I guess my point is that regardless of whether or not it's the funding for lending program or the LVR, you do see that emphasis by the Reserve Bank on the types of lending that's going on. I would want to look at what National directly were quoted as saying before I give too much.
Do you want to see prices come down at the? Do you want to see prices come down at the supermarket as a result of this market study?
Well, actually, one of the things I've been really mindful of, and I know there'll be a range of reasons for this, is that when we were able to travel into Australia and experience what it was to be a consumer at their supermarkets, significant price differentials there. And so that's just one thing that led us to believe that it was only right we look at whether or not New Zealanders are being treated fairly, particularly given we have real dominance in our market. We're also worried about suppliers. You often hear stories of them not feeling like they are being treated fairly. This allows us once and for all to give some confidence to consumers that both them and our producers are getting a fair deal.
Last question. If that study finds anti-competitive behaviour, can you guarantee that prices will come down?
We do have levers. The Commerce Commission, we've given them extra powers to really go in and properly investigate behaviours. We did it with fuel. Now we're doing it with our supermarkets, and we will act on what they find. There are ways that we can ensure that consumers are in a competitive environment and that they're getting best bang for buck.
You'll guarantee that prices will come down?
I'll guarantee that we'll act on what the Commerce Commission presents, but let's let them go and do the job, use the powers they have to fully investigate what's going on.
I'm going to get in there.